I've watched this pattern repeat itself for decades, and every time it's sold as something new. A pause in strikes, a suspension of kinetic action, a declaration that escalation is no longer necessary. The public hears restraint. What intelligence professionals see is leverage being consolidated. When President Trump announced the cancellation of a second wave of attacks against Venezuela while simultaneously keeping naval and air assets in place, this was not de-escalation. It was coercion at its most efficient point. You don't withdraw the fist when it's already at your opponent's throat. From an intelligence perspective, the seizure of Venezuelan oil tankers in the Caribbean, including vessels tied to sanctions evading ghost fleets, tells the real story. These operations don't happen in isolation. They require sustained surveillance, legal preparation, maritime coordination, and political authorization. You don't invest that level of effort if you intend to disengage. You do it when you believe pressure is finally producing measurable compliance. In this case, the release of political prisoners was not a goodwill gesture. It was a transactional response to force. What consistently gets lost in public discussion is that modern U.S. power no longer relies primarily on bombs. It relies on control of shipping lanes, insurance markets, dollar-denominated trade, and energy access. Venezuela's leadership understands that far better than most American commentators. Their economy survives on oil exports. When tankers are seized, routes disrupted, and buyers intimidated, the regime doesn't need a missile strike to feel existential pressure. It's already there. The intelligence failure comes not from misreading Venezuela, but from misrepresenting reality to the American public. Officials frame this moment as diplomacy succeeding where force might have failed. That's fiction. What actually succeeded was coercive containment. Military force remained credible precisely because it was not used yet. The threat worked because it was believable, proximate, and backed by visible action at sea. The strategic consequence of mislabeling coercion as restraint is long-term confusion. Allies misunderstand American intent, adversaries miscalculate thresholds, and U.S. voters are trained to believe wars end quietly without cost or consequence. They don't. They simply change form. The hard lesson here is simple and uncomfortable. When intelligence assessments are softened to fit political messaging, strategy becomes incoherent. Pausing strikes is not peace. It is leverage maintenance. And pretending otherwise is how credibility erodes one carefully worded announcement at a time. What the public rarely understands about sanctions enforcement is that it functions as a form of undeclared warfare, one that operates below the threshold of headlines but above the threshold of economic survival. When U.S. authorities seize tankers tied to Venezuela's oil exports, especially those operating under flags of convenience or opaque ownership structures, they are not improvising. These operations are the end product of intelligence fusion, financial tracking, maritime domain awareness, legal authorities, and diplomatic signaling converging in real time. The so-called ghost fleet exists precisely because sanctions bite. If sanctions were meaningless, no one would bother hiding. From my time in intelligence, I can tell you that maritime interdiction is one of the most revealing pressure tools in the arsenal. Tankers don't just move oil, they move risk. Insurers, port authorities, shipping brokers, and buyers all watch which vessels get seized and which don't. One interdiction sends ripples through an entire network. Suddenly, captains refuse routes, insurers raise premiums, and buyers delay contracts. You don't need to shut down every tanker. You only need to make the system unpredictable enough that it stops functioning smoothly. That's exactly what happened in the Caribbean. This is where narrative distortion creeps in. The administration describes these seizures as law enforcement actions, routine applications of sanctions law. Technically, that's true. Strategically, it's evasive. In intelligence terms, this is coercive signaling. Venezuela's leadership knows that the same surveillance and interdiction capability used against oil shipments can be scaled, intensified, or paired with kinetic force if compliance stops. The pause in strikes only works because these seizures continue. Remove one, and the other loses credibility. The intelligence failure isn't operational, it's communicative. Washington pretends sanctions are a substitute for force rather than an extension of it. That fiction allows policymakers to claim moral restraint while still exerting maximum pressure. But adversaries don't buy the story. Caracas certainly doesn't. They see the chessboard clearly: release prisoners, signal cooperation, keep oil flowing under U.S. tolerance, or watch the economic vice tighten further. The strategic consequence is a widening gap between what Americans think is happening and what actually governs state behavior. Sanctions enforcement becomes invisible warfare, and invisible warfare breeds complacency. When pressure eventually escalates or fails, the public is unprepared for either outcome. The hard lesson is this: ghost fleets exist because sanctions work, and seizures matter because force remains credible in the background. When intelligence professionals allow that reality to be softened into bureaucratic language, we don't make policy smarter, we make accountability disappear. One of the ugliest realities intelligence officers learn early is that authoritarian regimes treat human beings as inventory. Political prisoners are not moral failures in the eyes of those governments. They are assets held in reserve for moments of leverage. When Venezuela began releasing detainees in the wake of maritime seizures and a credible threat of U.S. strikes, this was not reform and it was not reconciliation. It was a transaction. Anyone trained to read coercive signaling recognizes the sequence immediately. Pressure rises, costs become immediate, and the regime pays in the cheapest currency available: people who no longer serve a deterrent function at home but can buy time abroad. From an intelligence perspective, prisoner releases are partial payments designed to test whether pressure will ease without surrendering control. The security services remain intact, the command structure remains loyal, and the coercive apparatus that keeps the regime in power stays fully funded to the extent resources allow. What changes is the regime's external posture. It offers a visible concession that plays well in Western media while preserving internal dominance. That is not accidental. It is calibrated. This is where Washington repeatedly misleads itself. Officials talk about confidence building measures and pathways to dialogue as if the release of prisoners signals a strategic shift. It does not. It signals that the pressure is working temporarily and that the regime is buying space to stabilize revenue flows, especially from oil. Intelligence failures are manufactured at this stage not by bad collection, but by selective interpretation. Analysts know the difference between structural reform and tactical compliance. Political leadership often chooses not to hear it. The strategic consequence of confusing transactions with transformation is predictable. Pressure relaxes prematurely. Sanctions enforcement becomes inconsistent. Military posture softens just enough for the regime to recover financially and politically. Once that happens, the remaining prisoners become the next tranche of leverage, and the cycle resets. I've seen this pattern across multiple theaters. It never ends the way policymakers hope, because hope is not an analytic variable. The harder lesson is that humanitarian outcomes achieved through coercion are fragile by design. They exist only so long as pressure is sustained and credible. When intelligence assessments are reframed to support a narrative of diplomatic progress, the very leverage that produced those releases begins to erode. In the end, people are rearrested, dissent is recriminalized, and Washington acts surprised again. What failed here was not empathy, but realism. Political prisoners were not freed because the regime changed its nature. They were released because the cost-benefit calculation demanded it. Pretending otherwise is how intelligence becomes fiction, and fiction is a poor foundation for strategy. What happens next is always more revealing than the pressure campaign itself. Once a regime makes a visible concession, releasing prisoners, signaling talks, adjusting rhetoric, the machinery in Washington shifts almost automatically into narrative management mode. This is not conspiracy. It is institutional reflex. Bureaucracies survive by declaring progress, and progress requires a story. Intelligence that complicates that story gets softened, delayed, or reframed until it fits a press briefing. I watched this dynamic from the inside long before Venezuela entered the current cycle. Analysts produce assessments that describe transactional compliance, temporary de escalation, and high likelihood of reversal once pressure eases. Those assessments are accurate, cautious, and usually unwelcome. Policy principles, on the other hand, need deliverables. They need to show restraint without appearing weak, coercion without admitting escalation, and success without acknowledging risk. The result is a carefully managed narrative in which sanctions are working, diplomacy is opening space, and military force is no longer necessary at this time. The media plays its role often unintentionally. Sound bites replace timelines. Prisoner releases become proof of moderation rather than evidence of pressure. Maritime seizures are described as law enforcement, not strategic coercion. The audience is led to believe that tensions are cooling when in fact they are being stabilized at a higher level of control. From an intelligence standpoint, this is dangerous because it trains decision makers to believe their own messaging. The intelligence failure here is not collection, analysis, or warning. It is institutional filtering. Information that challenges the preferred narrative is labeled pessimistic or unhelpful. Analysts are asked to update tone rather than substance. Over time, this process reshapes the internal understanding of events. Policymakers begin to believe that what they say publicly reflects reality. That is the moment when intelligence stops informing policy and starts servicing it. The strategic consequence is a loss of calibration. If Washington believes de-escalation is underway, it will gradually loosen enforcement, delay follow-on actions, and reduce visible military signaling. Adversaries notice immediately. They test boundaries, probe enforcement gaps, and reconstitute revenue streams. When pressure suddenly needs to be reapplied, it looks abrupt, arbitrary, and escalatory because the narrative said everything was improving. The hard lesson is, one, intelligence professionals learn painfully. Narrative management is not neutral. It reshapes risk perception, distorts decision-making, and creates false confidence. When governments prioritize story coherence over analytic accuracy, they don't just mislead the public, they mislead themselves. And once that happens, strategic surprise is no longer an accident. It is engineered. Every time U.S. officials invoke the lessons of Iraq, I listen carefully to what they emphasize and, more importantly, to what they leave out. Iraq didn't fail because intelligence officers lacked data. It failed because political leadership decided in advance what the intelligence needed to say. That distinction matters because the real lesson was never about faulty sources or analytic tradecraft. It was about the politicization of judgment, the selective elevation of worst-case assumptions, and the punishment of dissenting analysis. Those pathologies were never cured. They were merely rebranded. In the post-Iraq era, intelligence reforms focused heavily on process fusion centers, information sharing, red teaming. Those changes improved mechanics, but they did nothing to alter incentive structures. Analysts still advance professionally by aligning with policy priorities. Skeptical assessments still die quietly in coordination meetings. The phrase, "we learned our lesson," usually means we changed how we talk about it. In Venezuela, I see the same dynamics operating under a different vocabulary. The intelligence community today understands coercive leverage far better than it did in 2003. Analysts know that sanctions, interdictions, and military posture can produce short-term compliance without structural change. That understanding is not controversial inside classified channels. What changes is how that analysis is presented to decision makers and the public. The Iraq lesson that actually stuck was this: never admit uncertainty publicly. Ambiguity is politically dangerous. So complexity gets stripped out and probabilistic judgments become declarative claims. The strategic consequence is familiar. Policymakers convince themselves that pressure has altered regime behavior in durable ways. They interpret tactical compliance as evidence of strategic realignment. In Iraq, it was weapons programs that didn't exist. In Venezuela, it's political moderation that doesn't last. The underlying error is the same confusing intelligence assessment with policy aspiration. What was truly ignored from Iraq was the warning about institutional courage. Intelligence works only when analysts are willing to tell leaders what they don't want to hear and when leaders are willing to accept it. That relationship broke down 2 decades ago and was never fully repaired. Instead, we created systems that appear rigorous while quietly filtering out inconvenient conclusions. The hard lesson is this: intelligence failure is rarely about ignorance. It is about willful distortion. Iraq should have taught us that aligning intelligence to narrative produces catastrophic miscalculation. Yet here we are again, describing coercion as diplomacy and transactional compliance as reform. The details differ, but the structural failure is intact. When intelligence becomes a tool of reassurance instead of warning, the next surprise is already in motion. One of the quiet assumptions embedded in Washington's Venezuela strategy is that U.S. pressure still operates in a largely unipolar environment. That assumption is outdated. When I look at Venezuela today, I don't see a regime responding only to American coercion. I see a government hedging between power centers, exploiting fractures in the international system, and buying time by playing actors off one another. This is what multipolar adaptation looks like, and it severely constrains U.S. leverage. Russia, China, and Iran do not need to rescue Venezuela outright to blunt American pressure. They only need to provide enough alternatives, financial channels, energy partnerships, diplomatic cover to prevent total isolation. Intelligence reporting makes this clear. Oil that can't move directly to U.S. aligned markets finds its way through intermediaries. Currency flows reroute through non-Western systems. Political backing at international forums dilutes enforcement consensus. None of this neutralizes U.S. power, but it raises the cost of sustaining pressure indefinitely. The intelligence distortion occurs when Washington overestimates its control of outcomes. Seizing tankers and restricting exports hurts, but it does not guarantee compliance beyond the immediate term. Regimes under pressure adapt faster than bureaucracies expect. They learn which sanctions are strictly enforced, which are symbolic, and which can be bypassed with tolerable risk. In a multipolar system, perfect containment is no longer achievable. What remains is managed friction. The strategic consequence is a narrowing margin for error. If Washington misjudges how much pressure Venezuela can absorb or how much relief alternative partners can provide, it risks either escalation without leverage or de-escalation without compliance. Both outcomes undermine credibility. Allies see inconsistency. Adversaries see opportunity. The narrative of control becomes harder to sustain as reality intrudes. From an intelligence standpoint, this environment demands brutal honesty. Coercive power still works, but only when objectives are limited, pressure is sustained, and narratives are aligned with reality. What fails is the illusion that the United States can still dictate political outcomes unilaterally. Venezuela is not changing because Washington wills it to. It is adjusting because the cost curve temporarily favors compliance. That distinction matters enormously. The hard lesson is that multipolarity doesn't eliminate U.S. leverage. It exposes its limits. Intelligence professionals understand this. Political narratives often do not. When policymakers promise outcomes that exceed structural realities, intelligence is forced to bend to protect credibility. That bending is how fiction re-enters the system, and once it does, strategy becomes reactive rather than deliberate. The most dangerous moment in any pressure campaign is not escalation or restraint. It's the point where decision makers begin to believe their own storyline. That's when intelligence stops functioning as an early warning system and starts operating as a narrative support service. I've seen this transition up close, and it's never announced. It happens quietly through language shifts, briefing edits, and the steady replacement of conditional judgments with declarative claims. In the Venezuela case, the fiction is subtle but corrosive. We tell ourselves that a pause in strikes equals stability, that prisoner releases equal reform, and that sanctions enforcement equals control. Each statement contains a grain of truth. Together, they form a picture that doesn't survive contact with reality. The regime remains authoritarian, the coercive apparatus remains intact, revenue pathways adapt. Pressure works, but only so long as it is maintained and honestly described. The moment we pretend it has solved the problem, it stops doing so. This is not a failure of intelligence collection. We know how Venezuela's security services operate. We track oil flows, financial channels, and external partnerships. We understand the regime's survival logic. The failure occurs when that understanding is subordinated to political reassurance. Leaders don't want warnings, they want confirmation that their approach is succeeding. Intelligence then becomes curated, accurate in detail, misleading in implication. The strategic consequence is cumulative erosion. Allies begin to doubt American assessments when outcomes don't match promises. Adversaries learn that U.S. resolve fluctuates with domestic messaging cycles. Inside Washington, analysts grow cautious, then quiet. Risk gets underestimated, timelines stretch, and leverage dissipates. When reality finally forces a correction, renewed escalation, harsher enforcement, or visible failure, it appears abrupt and unplanned because the narrative said things were improving. I spent years separating facts from intent, capability from rhetoric. The hardest lesson was this: intelligence doesn't fail loudly, it fails politely. It fails by agreeing just enough to remain relevant while withholding the blunt conclusions that matter most. When that happens, policy drifts, credibility decays, and strategy becomes improvisation. The collapse of the American strategic narrative didn't begin with one war or one president. It began when intelligence was asked to soothe rather than warn, to justify rather than challenge. In a multipolar world, that habit is lethal. Power still exists, leverage still works, but only when grounded in reality. The moment intelligence becomes fiction, the system stops learning, and systems that stop learning eventually lose.